Please don't leave me out here in the cold. I'll give you a warm bed every night, pleaded the desperate Apache woman. Before diving into the tale, remember to like the video and drop a comment about where you're watching from. The last light had vanished behind the ridge, leaving the world stripped of color and sound. Jack Carter shoved the cabin door closed with a shoulder stiff from the bitter cold. The hinges groaned from years of use. He latched the iron lock and dropped 2 more split logs into the stove. Flames caught slowly flickering in quiet surrender. Outside, the wind howled across the ravine, like a living thing scraped along the roof and rattling the one loose shutter he'd meant to fix long ago. He didn't light the lamp yet, he preferred the dimness of the room at sunset. Shadows hid the corners he no longer wanted to face. The empty second chair, the shelf with a spot worn clean where a cradle once rested, the drawer with a wedding ring untouched for 3 winters. Jack sat at the table arms on the scarred wood, letting the silence settle around him. Out here, silence wasn't peace. It was the only constant. At first a sound so soft, he thought it was the stove creaking a scrape, then a faint knock like bone against wood. Jack stayed still. Cabins this far out saw visitors only when trouble came bearing a face. Another knock followed, barely there, but undeniably real. He rose slowly, joints stiff from the day, and reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. He didn't raise it, just carried it across his arm as he crossed to the door, opening it just enough to glimpse the figure outside. The wind shoved a blast of ice with it. A woman stood on the porch, small against the night, but upright legs locked fur-firm. Frost clung her shawl to her shoulders, her hair half-tangled across her cheeks. Moccasins soaked. Her dress was torn at the neckline, split along one thigh, stiff against her skin. Lips cracked, breath sharp with cold. She didn't step forward, didn't ask if he was the cabin's owner. She only looked at him, eyes dark and steady, and whispered through chattering teeth, "Please, don't leave me out here." Jack said nothing, studying her a long moment. The wind tugged at the fringe of her dress. Her chest showed where the tear wouldn't close. Her arms shook under the shawl, yet she held herself rigid as though she'd break before kneeling. She spoke again, voice rasping harsher. "I'll give you a bed. Warm. Every night. Just not out here. Not tonight." No name, no tears. Only a desperate offer of what little she had, and for a heartbeat Jack considered shutting the door and letting the storm claim her. Those who tangled with Apache warriors often ended up chased or waking to a knife at their throat. But she was alone. Only one uneven trail in the snow behind her. No second figure in the shadows. Jack stepped back without a word, opening the door wide enough for her to enter. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold with a stumble she tried to hide. He shut the door, dropped the latch. The stove's warmth barely reached her first. Jack laid the rifle on the table and pulled down an old horse blanket from the peg. He moved with practicality, not gentleness, and draped it over her shoulders. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth burn and soothe at once. Her hands glowed red from the cold. Bruises and rope marks marred her skin. He asked nothing. He wanted no answers yet. She stood near the stove, holding the blanket closed with one hand. The neckline tear revealed her collarbone, just enough chest to force him to look away. Breath's shallow skin scraped raw along her knees and thighs. Jack poured water into the iron pot, set it over the stove. The cabin hummed with tin clinks and fire hisses. Only these sounds filled the space. She didn't sit. He didn't offer a chair. He handed her an old mug, guiding her shaking fingers around it. Not a drop spilled. After a long pause, her voice came steady but soft. "I won't stay if you don't want me here," she said. But don't send me back into the dark. I can work. I can earn it. Just not out there tonight, Emmy Lou Whitlow said. Jack Carter didn't answer. No nod. No softening of his expression. He reached past her to the hook near the stove and pulled down another blanket thicker, lined with old wool. He spread it on the floor near the stove and stepped back. She understood immediately. She knelt first, lowering herself carefully. Every movement measured careful not to rip her dress further. One shoulder of the blanket slipped off, letting her skin flush with returning warmth. She wrapped the wool tight around her and curled on her side, facing the stove. Her eyes stayed open, taking him in, gauging the man who had opened his door to her. Jack dragged a chair toward the far corner, the legs scraping across the plank floor. He sat with his back against the wall, not pretending to sleep, yet not watching her either. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters with sharper urgency. Inside, the cabin no longer felt empty. Nothing had changed except the shape on the floor and the soft rise of her breath. Night pressed on, but it no longer belonged solely to him. By dawn, the fire had dwindled, leaving only a dull orange glow in the stove's belly. Jack woke stiff in the chair, one leg numb, back locked from sleeping crookedly. For a moment, he forgot she was there. The shape on the floor, a pile of blankets at first glance, shifted slightly. A small breath caught in her throat, and the memory of the night before settled over him as he fed 2 logs into the stove. The sound stirred her again. Her eyes opened, alert, trained to react if the world moved wrong. She sat slowly, blanket clutched around herself. The torn dress clung to her collarbone and shoulder creased where it had frozen and thawed. She didn't ask where she was. She already knew. What she seemed to wonder now was if she was still allowed to stay. Jack didn't greet her, didn't ask how she slept. He crossed to the shelf, taking down a tin bowl and the heel of cornbread from the day before. He broke it into pieces, dropping them into a pan with water to soften. Her eyes followed every move. Hunger had settled deep in her posture, quiet and old. She didn't speak until he placed the pan on the stove and stepped away. "I didn't steal anything," she said, voice rough in the quiet night. "Not from your cabin, not from any wagon. They said I did so they could take me." Her tone wasn't pleading, just a statement of fact she didn't want left to assumption. Jack didn't look at her when he answered. "I didn't ask." "I know," she said. When the cornbread softened, he slid the pan near her on the floor. She didn't lunge for it, didn't devour it as if starved past manners. She ate in small, careful bites, testing each chew. He watched the way she held the crust in both hands, careful not to drop a crumb. Fingers bruised along the knuckles. Jack stepped outside to the well with the empty pail. The wind cut sharper in the daylight. The ground was hard with frost. He scanned the ridge out of habit. No tracks, no smoke, no riders sweeping the horizon. Whoever had chased or sold her hadn't followed this far, not yet. When he returned, she had stood and folded the wool blanket where she'd slept, setting it aside near the wall. The thinner horse blanket lay across the bench instead of in a heap. No woman seeing his cabin for the first time would bother tidying it unless she had spent her life avoiding blame. "You got a name?" he finally asked. She hesitated just a breath. "Emmy Lou." He nodded once, neither welcoming nor rejecting. He offered no name in return. She didn't ask. He pointed toward the small wash basin near the door. "Water's warm if you need it." She crossed the room with the same quiet caution as the night before. The split seam of her dress opened along her thigh, revealing raw skin rubbed by cold and travel. She didn't try to cover it. Her hands were steady as she dipped the cloth and wiped her face, then the back of her neck, brushing hair aside with fingers that trembled once before stilling. Jack didn't stare, but he didn't turn away either. Questions had gnawed at him overnight: how far she'd walked, who had torn her dress, how she escaped, whether anyone would come looking. He didn't ask any of it yet. Asking made things real. Real things had a way of lingering. When she finished, Jack Carter nodded toward the chair. "Sit before you fall," he said. She lowered herself carefully, keeping the blanket tight around her chest to cover the tear that revealed the top curve of her cleavage. The edge of the dress had split unevenly, and a loose stitch near her shoulder dangled by 3 threads. She followed his gaze, holding the fabric closed with one hand. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. She shifted slightly, not in refusal, but the way someone braces themselves before stepping through something sharp. "West. A trading post near St. David. They took me from my people after a raid. Show me twice." "The last ones tried to hand me off to men in town for whiskey," she added. Her voice didn't waver. Shame didn't color her words, only exhaustion. Jack knew better than to ask what they'd done before attempting to trade her. "You ran from them," he said. "I bet the one who held the rope," she said simply. "They hit me and thought I'd break. When I slept, I walked. Don't know how far." She paused, eyes drifting to the frost creeping along the window corners. "I thought I'd die before I found a house." She didn't add that she expected him to turn her away. That much had already been clear the night before when he opened the door. Jack crossed to the trunk in the corner, the one he hadn't opened since the fever took everything he had left. He lifted the lid and pulled out a folded wool undershirt and an old pair of flannel trousers. The legs were too short for him now, but long enough for her. He set them on the table without a word. She stared for a long moment, like she didn't trust they were being offered. "You want me to work for them?" she asked. "No." She stepped closer, cautious. "You won't touch me for them." "No," he said again, firmer this time. Some of the tension eased from her shoulders, but not the weariness. She reached for the clothes like an animal edging toward water. Then she looked around the room and back at him. "Where?" He glanced toward the small alcove behind the wood-pile curtain. Not much of a place, but out of sight. She nodded once and disappeared behind it. He heard the soft drag of fabric over cold skin, the small hiss of breath as she pulled the dress from her body. He kept his eyes on the stove, though his thoughts wandered where he didn't ask them to. When she returned, the shirt hung past her hips, and the trousers were tied at the waist with a strip torn from her old dress. The bruises on her wrists were clearer now, and the scrape along her collarbone glowed red with returning warmth. The swell of her chest pushed against the fabric unhidden by the shirt. Neither mentioned it. She stood near the table waiting for direction like someone allowed inside, but still feeling temporary. Jack nodded toward the stove. "Sit. Eat more." She obeyed without a word. Outside, frost clung hard to the ground, the sky the dull gray of old tin. Inside the cabin no longer felt like a place meant for one man. Whether that eased something in him or tightened it, Jack couldn't tell. She hadn't asked to leave, and he hadn't told her to go. That was enough for the morning. By midday the wind had settled, but the cold remained. A day where every breath hung in the air and every sound felt closer than it should. Jack stepped outside to fetch the axe splitting more wood before light began to fade. He glanced once to be sure she stayed inside, though he hadn't told her the door remained shut behind him. Something about that told him she understood not to wander. The woodpile, set a few yards from the cabin, half buried in frost-hardened dirt. He lifted the axe and brought it down with steady force, the crack of splitting logs echoing off the ravine walls. Each strike steadied his thoughts, though not enough to quiet the questions creeping in since the stormy night. How long could she stay? Was someone still hunting her? Had he made a mistake, opening his door? When he carried the wood back inside, she knelt near the hearth, rolling the thin horse blanket from the night into a neat fold. She looked up as he entered, not startled, only measuring him the way she measured everything. The borrowed clothes hung loose on her frame. The wool shirt slipped at one shoulder collar, stretched to reveal the edge of her collarbone. Her hair was still tangled from sleep, and snow falling across her cheek. Jack set the wood down by the stove. "You could dry your dress by the fire," he said. "Leave it in that bundle too long, and it'll rot." She hesitated, then slowly moved to do as he suggested. He pointed toward a cedar peg on the wall near the stovepipe. Emmy Lou Whitlow carefully pulled the torn dress from where she had folded it on the bench and stood near the heat hanging it so the fabric would thaw instead of burn. The tear at the chest and along her thigh looked worse in the firelight, edges stiff and frayed where the cold had split them wider. Jack Carter took a needle and spool of thread from the small drawer by the table. The thread wasn't a perfect match for the deerskin, but it would hold. She washed his hands silent until he pulled a chair closer to the stove. "You've sewn leather before?" she asked, uncertain whether she should hand it over. "Jackets, saddlebags," he replied. "Not women's things," he added, "but thread, don't care who wears it." She stared at the dress for a moment, then stepped closer and held it out. Their fingers brushed when he took it. The brief contact stirred something in both of them. Jack sat the dress across his knees and began stitching the torn slit at her thigh needle, pushing through stiff, cold hide. His hands were scarred and rough, yet his movements stayed careful. Emmy Lou stood beside the stove, neither hovering nor moving far, watching as he worked the seam closed. "You were Army," she said, after a silence that lingered too long. "Your coat and boots show it." He didn't look up from the stitching. "Scout," she nodded, absorbing the information. "You've lived alone a long time, long enough not to hear another voice in months, unless I ride for salt or kerosene." He said nothing about the graves on the ridge or the fever that had taken his family. If she guessed, she didn't press. Emmy Lou knelt near the stove to warm her hands, leaning close to the heat. The shirt shifted again, stretching across the curve of her chest. The faint shadow of her cleavage pressed against the wool. She didn't seem aware of how much was shown, or maybe she did and didn't care. Jack reminded himself to keep his eyes on the seam. He finished the thigh rip first, then started on the neckline tear, pulling the fabric together enough to give coverage without warping the shape. The memory of her standing on the porch skin, exposed to the wind, flickered briefly through his mind. He didn't let it linger. "Where were you headed?" he asked without looking up. "I wasn't," she said plainly. "Just away. I thought the cold would kill me before anyone found me." "You thought a cabin this far out would take you in," he said. "I thought maybe an animal would find me first," she replied, straightforward. "Men only open doors when they want something," he said. She didn't add that she had already offered the only bargaining chip she thought would work. Jack remembered her words on the porch, felt their weight in the silence that followed. "They come looking for you?" he asked. "They might if they wake sober," she said. "But they were drinking hard before they slept. I walked until my feet bled. I don't know what hour they would have noticed," she added. "You see any riders on your way up the ravine?" "No, just tracks from a mule cart 2 days old." She studied the tracks. "This place is far from their reach. That's why I risked the cold." Men don't chase what they think will freeze before morning. But Jack tied off the last stitch and laid the dress across the back of the chair to finish drying. The seams were uneven, but closed. He stepped back. She touched the repaired fabric with a careful hand, tracing the new stitch line. Outside, a distant coyote's call cut through the quiet. The sound was thin, carried on air that smelled of nothing but cold. Jack glanced toward the window, instincts alive beneath years of silence. Emmy Lou stood, two shoulders tensing, until the wind swallowed the sound again. "You can stay until the weather breaks," he said finally. "After that, we'll see." She didn't thank him. She simply nodded as though thanks would make it weak or temporary. He took the bucket and stepped outside again to check the cattle pan before dark. The sky was already a steel gray, the cold biting harder near the water trough. When he returned, the stove had been fed, and the floors swept clean of bark and ash. She sat at the table, the mended dress folded neatly beside her. Her hands rested still, her back straight, but not rigid. Jack noticed what any observer would have from the first night she hadn't trusted the room enough to sleep like someone at ease. She hadn't. She waited, testing the morning for danger. Now, with the dress fixed, no door showed threat to her. The edge of that fear dulled, but didn't disappear. That night came down again. Jack unrolled his bedroll near the far wall, setting a log on the fire to hold until midnight. Emmy Lou laid the wool blanket near the stove, but didn't curl as small as she had the first night. Her breathing eased, first slowing into a calmer rhythm. She faced the room instead of the door. She didn't ask for more than the story she had already given. She didn't ask for his. Outside, the land remained frozen, the ravine holding its silence tight around them. Inside, the cabin belonged to two now, even if neither spoke the words or named what that meant. And for the first time in years, Jack Carter didn't wonder whether morning would feel the same as night. The next morning came slow, pale frost light washing through the small window. The fire had burned low again, yet the cabin held its warmth better than the night before. Jack woke first, as he always did, but his eyes went to her before the stove. Emmy Lou Whitlow still lay wrapped in the wool blanket, one hand visible near her chin. Her breathing was deep, but cautious. She hadn't slept like someone who trusted walls yet, but she'd slept long enough to set more wood on the stove and pour water into the tin pot before stirring. The scrape of the kettle lid finally coaxed her eyes open. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. The collar of her shirt slipped just enough to reveal the top curve of her chest, and the line where bruising along her collarbone had faded to yellow. She studied him silently. Jack set the dented tin cups on the table and reached for the small jar of coffee grounds. Supplies were low. He had meant to ride into town the week before, but the cold had deepened and kept him home. A question any listener might have asked pressed at the back of his mind. How long could he keep another mouth fed out here? He didn't speak it aloud. Emmy Lou finally rose. The blanket slid down, catching against the ties of her trousers, and she nodded to keep them up. She folded the wool as precisely as the night before, careful not to leave a mess in someone else's space. When she moved to the basin to wash her face, her bare feet made no sound on the plank floor. Jack noticed then the soles were blistered red where the moccasins had worn through. He wondered why she hadn't tended them yet. "There's salve in the box by the shelf," he said without looking directly at her. "For cracks and cuts, I used it last winter on my hands." She paused, dabbing her face with a cloth. "I didn't want to put hands on things without being told," she said. "You're told," he said simply. She crossed to the small wooden box where he kept bandages, pitch pine, and a tin of tallow rendered with herbs. She opened it like someone accessing what didn't belong to her but needed. She sat on the bench, pulling one foot into her lap, rubbing the salve over the cracked skin with quiet control. The motion lifted her pant leg enough for him to see the bruise along her shin and the half-healed cut from the cold. She didn't wince, though her skin looked raw. Jack poured the coffee into cups when it was ready, steam rising thin in the cold air. He set one near her without a word. She studied it first, testing the heat with her lips. The bitterness struck hard, but she drank anyway. "You going into town soon?" she asked, not casual, not fearful. "Just knew someone would ask eventually," he said. "Was supposed to go last week. Could stretch another 5 days if I ration right." "Longer if you eat less," she said without flinching at his bluntness. "I'll eat what you give. Won't waste." Jack leaned against the table. The nearest town lay 2 miles down the ridge road. Folks there had seen Apache raiding last season and wouldn't think twice before making noise if they saw him. "I won't go with you," she said. "I know better than to show my face where white men gather," he said. He didn't argue she was right. Listeners might have wondered sooner. "What would happen if someone saw you here?" she asked, catching him off guard. His eyes snapped to hers. She held his gaze not harshly but steady. "You look up that way when the ground freezes." "I seen it through the window," he said. He didn't want to talk about it, but the question revealed something he hadn't noticed. She watched him, even when he wasn't looking. "My wife and daughter," he said at last, voice low but even. "Fever took them 3 winters back, buried them up where the ground wouldn't flood when thaw came." Emmy Lou offered no pity. She only nodded once, as if that small truth answered some unspoken question about why he lived out here alone. "You have people waiting?" Jack Carter asked. "They think I'm dead or gone," Emmy Lou Whitlow said. "Either way, they stopped waiting long before I was taken." She didn't specify whether she meant kin tribe or something else, but the way she said it made clear she had no one claiming her now. Jack took the last of the jerky from the tin and set 2 strips on the table. She looked at the meat, then back at him. He just shrugged. "Better in you than rotting in the box." When she finished, she gathered the thread and needle from where he'd left them and returned them to the drawer. She tapped the folded dress once. "I'll wear it again when it dries." "Your clothes won't fit right for long. They cover what needs covering," he said. She met his eyes, then something unreadable there. "You didn't take what I offered at the door." He gripped the edge of the table to steady the thought burning in memory. "Didn't need to. Most men would have." She said it not as praise, not as a test, just a fact. "I'm not most men," he said, not with pride, but quiet resignation. The silence that followed wasn't the same as before. It carried something unspoken, something growing even without either inviting it. Late afternoon, he went outside again to mend a section of fence near the small pasture. He didn't ask her to help, but she stepped out after finishing the dishes and followed him without a word. She carried a bundle of cut rope and nails he'd left by the door, kneeling to hold the post steady while he hammered. The wind cut sharp over the ridge, and as she braced the timber, the sleeve of her shirt slipped farther, showing the slope of her shoulder and the curve where the shirt didn't quite hide what lay beneath. He tried not to look, but his hand brushed hers as he reached for the next nail, and neither pulled away. "You fixed things alone a long time," she said quietly. "Long enough to forget how to work with 2 hands, not both mine," he answered. She pressed the post tighter as he struck again. The fence held. So did whatever had shifted between them since that stormy night she knocked on his door. They'd said fewer words than a page, but the day had changed something no one needed to name yet. Inside, she hung the mended dress near the stove to finish drying. Jack set his coat on the peg and scraped mud from his boots. The cabin no longer carried the untouched quiet of a man alone. It held breath footsteps, and the kind of silence that waited instead of ending. Night came cold and early, but Jack didn't dread waking to an empty room. The sound of her moving near the fire answered the question he hadn't admitted he'd been asking since the moment she knocked. Night fell heavy and black, swallowing the ridge hole. The stove held a steady burn, but the cold pressed against the logs, trying to creep through the walls. Jack unrolled his bedroll near the far corner again, though he didn't lie down immediately. Emmy Lou settled by the stove, as she had each night, the wool blanket wrapped around her legs, his undershirt slipping at the collar when she shifted to the fire. Her dress hung dry now beside the stovepipe. The rough stitches were firm but crooked along the seams he'd mended. The beadwork that once lined the edges looked half torn away. Anyone hearing the story might have wondered, had she made it herself, or was it taken from her people? He hadn't asked. She hadn't said. She looked at the dress once, then turned away. Jack pulled a second blanket from the trunk, the one he hadn't used since before the fever took his family. He didn't think before speaking. "Take the bed tonight. The floor's colder now than it was." "I won't take your place," she said, looking at him long before answering. "I didn't ask you to take it," he said. "I'm not made of glass. I've slept on worse ground than this." She studied his face, searching for any hidden trap in the offer. Finally she stood and gathered the blanket around herself. She walked to the corner where the narrow bed frame sat against the wall, half hidden behind a cedar chest. The mattress was old, but dry, stuffed with wool and straw. She sat on the edge, fingers hesitating over the cover, then lay down, slowly facing the room instead of the wall. Jack lowered himself to the floor near the stove, rolling the extra blanket over his shoulders. The boards were rough but familiar, and the fire's warmth reached him better there than where his bedroom usually lay. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, the smell of wool and smoke didn't remind him solely of the night his world had shrunk to graves. Near midnight, he woke to movement, not fear or panic, just a subtle shift of weight. He opened his eyes and saw her sitting up on the bed, hair falling around her face. Her eyes stayed fixed on the window frost crawling in a white web across the glass. She wasn't looking out, she was listening. "You hear something?" Jack Carter asked, voice low. She didn't startle. "I heard your breath stop. Thought you woke from something bad," he added, blinking once. He hadn't spoken of the dreams, the ones that came when his guard dropped. "Just the cold in my bones," she said. She lay back down but didn't close her eyes right away. "I won't leave in the night," she whispered. "You don't need to keep watch." "I know," he said, though he didn't mention that his body still woke the way it had when he'd followed scout trails after dark, silent, half ready to fight. At a moment's notice, the frost on the window thickened like glass. Jack stood before she stirred, lighting the stove again. Heat spread through the cabin in slow rolling waves. She woke to the scrape of iron against ash and sat up, blanket falling to her lap. Her shirt had slipped low again, showing the curve of her chest before she pulled it closed without a word. The water basin sat near the door, rimmed with thin ice. He broke it with his knuckles and poured water into the pot to warm. Supplies were nearly gone. Flour dusted the bottom of its sack, coffee was finished, and only 2 strips of jerky and a handful of dried beans remained. He spoke before she could read the worry on his face. "Weather holds another day. I'll ride to town tomorrow, get flour, salt, whatever else I can haul." She didn't offer to go. Instead, she asked what someone might if listening from the start. "Are there men there who will ask why you're not alone anymore?" He met her eyes. "Some will, some won't care. But if word spreads a woman like you is here, others may come, for reasons that don't end kind." She took that in without flinching. "Then I won't step outside while you're gone," she said. "If anyone rides near, move into the rocks behind the ravine, stay down until dark," he said. "There's a ledge above the dry creek. No one finds it unless shown." "You showed up before?" she asked. "No," he said. She nodded once, understanding that meant more than just a hiding place. After they ate the last of the beans and cornbread, Jack donned his coat and stepped outside to check the livestock. Only 2 cattle remained in the corral. The others he'd slaughtered or sold before the freeze. The horses stamped in the lean-to breath, fogging the air. Emmy Lou came to the door and watched him through the gap where the slab didn't seal. The wind hit her face, and for a moment something softer flickered in her eyes, the kind of look someone wears when they haven't stood in daylight without fear in a long while. She didn't step outside, but she didn't close the door either. "You got a gun inside?" he asked when he returned. She glanced at the rifle over the doorframe. "I can shoot if I must." He raised a brow. "Ever used one?" "My uncle taught me before I bled a woman's blood," she said. "Shot deer and men both." He believed her. Another unspoken question answered how she had survived this long. He set the rifle on the table and showed her the cartridges in the box beneath the shelf. "If someone tries the door while I'm gone, you point this first and ask nothing." She stepped close enough to test the weight, her fingers brushing his hand. For a moment, neither moved. She watched him with the same steady gaze she'd held since the night she arrived, but now there was something warmer beneath it, something neither of them named. "Why'd you open the door?" she asked quietly. "Before the cold took me," Jack said honestly. "Didn't plan to." "You weren't begging to live easy," she said. "I've seen men beg with more pride and still die. You weren't begging for comfort." "Just to live," he said. She held his gaze at the corner of her mouth. No smile, just memory. "I would have given you whatever you asked. I didn't ask," he added. She lowered the rifle and set it back on the table. "If you had, I would have stayed anyway," she said steady. "But not like this." That answer pressed deep, more honest than anything either had spoken since she arrived. By evening, the plan was fixed. Jack would leave at first light. She would stay inside with the stove banked and a rifle nearby, and neither would move otherwise. The thought of that door closing with only one of them behind it made the silence between them feel different than before. Not empty, not fearful, just waiting. By the time the first light scraped over the ridge, Jack Carter had his coat on and the saddle cinched. The horse stamped, blowing fog from its nose, uneasy from the cold, and the scent of weather rolling in from the north. Emmy Lou Whitlow stood just inside the doorway. The rifle rested against the frame, his shirt hanging loose at one shoulder. Her hair was half braided, not for vanity, but to keep it from catching in her face if she had to run. Jack tightened the strap on a saddlebag, the one holding the last of his coin scraps from hides traded jerky sold, and a rifle he'd parted with 2 summers ago. Anyone watching might have wondered what he could buy with so little, but he planned to stretch it as far as he could, flour, salt beans, lard, maybe new stitching thread if he could barter. Before he mounted, he pointed toward the rocks along the ravine. "If riders come down the slope, you'll hear them before you see them. Don't wait to know who they are. Go behind the dry creek and stay low." She didn't blink. "If you don't come back by dark, I'll come back," he added. Not a promise, just stated as fact. Something unspoken hung between them. Listeners might have wondered, did he trust her not to leave while he was gone? She answered first. "I won't run," she said. "If they come for me, they'll find the door empty, not your blood." He studied her face a beat longer than needed, then nodded once and swung into the saddle. She stepped back just enough to watch him ride off, but didn't follow his path with her eyes. Instead, she scanned the ridge and trail beyond as if expecting someone else might appear. The road to town cut through frost-bitten scrub, a flat lattice of earth marked with old wagon ruts. Jack rode with his coat collar high and hat pulled low, rein loose on the wind, but grip sure. The cold bit through leather, but his mind kept drifting back to the cabin, not in fear, just in a way that marked it as no longer empty. He crossed the frozen creek near Miller's Pass. The sky brightened, but the wind carried the smell of snow not far off. He thought of the cattle, the roof needing patching, and the fact that anyone in town who saw him buying enough supplies for 2 would start talking. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Emmy Lou banked the stove and swept ash from the floor with the stiff broom leaning against the wall. She checked the windows, then the door latch, and then unpacked the folded dress near the heat. Anyone listening might have asked, would she still wear it, or bury it with a life she'd shed? She laid it across the bed to decide later. She spent the morning mending what she could, loose stitching on one of his coats, the tear in a feed sack, the split lining of the mittens hanging by the door. Her hands moved fast and quiet, pausing now and then to listen the way someone does when long silence has become a warning, not comfort. Near midday, she stepped onto the porch just long enough to glance at the water trough and gather kindling stacked under the awning. The cold hit her lungs fierce, but she moved quickly, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing stirred but solitary hawks circling above the ravine. Down the road, Jack reached the outskirts of town. 3 cabins, a blacksmith shed with half a roof, and a saloon with its crooked sign. Hoofprints and wagon tracks cut through the frosty mud. Smoke curled from 2 chimneys. He tied his horse at the rail outside the trading post. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco and kerosene. Silas Boone, the storekeeper, squinted when Jack stepped in. "Thought you'd hold up till spring," he grunted. "Almost did," Jack said, setting the coin pouch on the counter. "What you got? Flour beans, lard coffee, if cheap thread lamp oil. Salt, if there's coin left," Silas snorted. "Feeding an army now, cold's been hard, takes more to make it through." He weighed the words too long, and Jack could feel suspicion as easy as breath. Folks remembered who buried their dead and stayed gone from company. While Silas filled the sacks, Jack kept his back to the wall. A man and his son came in for nails. He fed them, too. Both glanced at him, then at the supplies piling up. People in small towns counted everything they saw, especially when it didn't fit the pattern. By the time Jack loaded the goods onto the horse, clouds had thickened overhead. He didn't linger. Snow would come by night if it kept pace. Jack Carter cut off the main trail halfway back, taking the ridgeway that dropped into the ravine, avoiding the open flats near the cabin. Emmy Lou Whitlow knelt by the stove, sorting through the small stack of split wood and setting the last dry pieces aside for evening. Anyone listening might have wondered what she'd do if he didn't return by dark, hide, run, or stay, but she didn't appear torn. She moved like someone who'd already chosen the ground she would stand on. When Jack crested the last rise, the sun had dropped behind the clouds, and the air smelled of iron and snow. She heard the horse before she saw it. She didn't rush out. She opened the door and waited, rifle within arm's reach, but not in her hands. He unloaded the supplies onto the porch, making 2 trips. She helped without being asked, setting each sack on the table, hair falling forward as she worked. When she lifted a bag too heavy for her size, he took it from her hands. For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't recoil when his fingers brushed hers. "You were gone longer than I thought," she said. "Road rough and frozen. Slow me some. Anyone see you low enough for 2? Let him wonder," he said, though part of him knew. Wondering was how trouble began. She stood at the table, resting her hands on the wood. "If they come, I don't hide behind you. I stand beside or I disappear." "Not between," he said. He studied her face, steady, unshaken. not afraid to earn her place but unwilling to cost him for it. The question of what she meant to him remained unspoken. But the cabin no longer felt like a place ghosts owned. Outside, the first flakes of snow fell slow and deliberate, the kind that stayed when it landed. Inside, Jack closed the door and dropped the latch without thinking. Snow thickened through the night, steady and smothering, erasing tracks and swallowing sound. By morning, the drifts reached the porch rail, and wind pressed white banks against the cabin walls. The world outside was the color of breath, and the ravine below vanished beneath a sheet of pale silence. Jack stoked the fire, early hands stiff from sleeping on the floor again. Emmy Lou had taken the bed a second night without argument. Though she still slept lightly, her posture never fully surrendered to rest. When she rose, the room glowed faintly from the stove and the sky beyond the window. She pulled on the mended dress instead of his shirt. The seams puckered where he'd stitched them, but it fit closer to her body. The neckline, though, repaired, still dipped enough to show the soft line of her chest, and the fabric across her hips clung where it had stretched wet and dried again. He didn't comment, but he noticed, and she noticed, he noticed. The morning raised a question anyone might have asked since her arrival. What would keep her here, now that the cold no longer threatened death? She answered with her next actions. Without being told, she fetched water from the pot, stirred the flour with the little cornmeal remaining, and shaped small flat cakes for the stove pan. The smell of toasting meal filled the cabin slow and warm. While she worked, Jack pulled on his coat and stepped outside to clear snow from the lean-to roof before its weight collapsed the beams. The air cut hard, but the quiet settled deeper than fear. He shoveled paths to the woodpile, and water trough breath fogging the air, boots sinking almost to the knee. From the doorway, she watched him, arms wrapped across her middle for warmth. When he paused at the rail, she stepped into the snow barefoot, surprising him. Before he could speak, she bent, lifted a chunk of split wood, and carried it inside. Her feet sank, toes reddening, but she moved like someone who had survived worse than cold. "Your feet will freeze through," he said when he came back and stamping snow from his boots. She set the wood near the stove and wiped melted flakes from her ankles with the hem of her dress. "I've walked on ice with no skin left on the heel," she said. "This is just winter." He didn't argue, but fetched a scrap of wool from the trunk and laid it near the fire. She sat on it when he pointed to the dress riding up, showing the curve of her calf. He didn't look away fast enough, and she didn't cover her leg until after she noticed the silence that followed. She asked what anyone might have wondered how far was the nearest ranch, half-day west, he said. "A man named Rufus Lane runs cattle across the flats." Jack checked the door latch out of habit. "He's nosy, but not brave. If he saw smoke this way, he might send someone to see if I died over winter." "Does he know your wife is buried here?" she asked. "He came once after she passed. Brought me old news and walked back with more questions and sense," Jack replied. "I sent him away. He hasn't come back." Emmy Lou Whitlow absorbed that, letting another gap in the story fill itself. The neighbors stayed distant. Some men built silence around grief the way others built fences. By midday, the snow eased and the sky thinned to a pale gray. Jack Carter brought in water from the well and checked the animals again. Emmy Lou knelt by the stove, rubbing salve across her wrist, where rope scars still showed. The sight drew a quiet question from him. "Why'd they take you in the first place, the ones who sold you?" he asked. She kept her eyes on her hands. "My band split after soldiers came through the last time. Some were killed, some taken. I stayed with my aunt's family, thought we were far enough." "White trappers found your camp," she continued, They killed 2 men and tied 3 women. I was one. Jack stood still, saying nothing, though she kept speaking. They traded us at a way station near St. David. 1 woman sold south. Another died on the trail. I was kept. Then fought. They beat me. Tried to trade me again. She didn't cry, telling it. Her voice held the calm of someone long past shock. Jack's hand tightened on the back of the chair, but he didn't speak the anger that flared inside him. You think they'll still look for you? He asked. They might if they wake sober, but not long in this cold, she said. They'd sooner chase another than risk the snow biting them. That answer settled part of what any listener might have wondered. Was danger still coming? Not gone, but distant, as the afternoon dimmed. Jack fetched a strip of rawhide and began fixing the broken latch on the shed door. Emmy Lou followed him outside, wearing the flannel trousers under her dress to keep her legs from freezing. The layering stirred something unspoken in him, this mix of survival and womanhood rarely seen in frontier cabins. She stood beside him, holding the boards steady as he hammered the hinge back into place. When the wind cut harsher across the ridge, she stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his arm without thought. He set the hammer down and looked at her. She didn't move away. You said something the night you came, he murmured, voice low. About giving me a bed, she said, eyes steady. I thought it was the only way to stay alive. Now she hesitated not in fear, but in honesty. Now I stay, because you didn't ask it. The air between them thickened with a question neither needed to speak. He didn't reach for her, nor did he step back. Inside the cabin felt smaller when they returned, though nothing had changed but the space between breaths. She moved to hang the wet hem of the dress by the fire. As she bent, the collar slipped again. This time she didn't adjust it right away, and he didn't pretend not to see her skin warm now, rather than blue with cold. That night he didn't unroll his bedroll immediately, and she didn't lie down without glancing his way first. The storm had sealed off the world outside, but inside something else had begun to thaw. Snow held through the night, thick enough to swallow sound. Jack didn't unroll his bed at first. He sat in the chair by the table. Lamplight low, watching the stove fires settle. Emmy Lou crouched near the hearth, turning the last flatbreads in the pan so they wouldn't burn. Her dress, still damp at the hem from the afternoon outside, clung to her thighs where she'd layered the trousers beneath. When she stood, the fabric shifted against her hips, and the shirt collar he'd sewn back together slipped just enough to show the slope of her chest again. She didn't hide this time. He didn't pretend not to notice. She carried the food to the table and sat across from him. The quiet wasn't stiff or empty anymore. It was thick with things both of them felt, but neither named. While they ate, she asked what most would have wondered sooner. If the men who took me come, what will you do? He chewed slowly, then set the bread down. Shoot if I must. Send them off if they're smart enough to turn around. You'd be gone into the rocks before they got near. And if they bring others, she pressed, meeting his eyes. Then they'll learn this cabin doesn't belong to them, he said. She took that answer not as bluster, but as a fact she could rely on. After they finished eating, she cleared the table without being told. Jack watched her movements, quiet, steady, sure in the small space. She belonged in the room now, in a way no stranger would. That raised another unspoken question. Where would she sleep once the floor and bed were no longer just necessity? Emmy Lou Whitlow answered herself. After stacking the plates and banking the stove, she didn't return to the hearth. Instead, she stood at the foot of the bed, resting one hand on the wool blanket. You sleeping there again? She asked, not timid, just testing the ground between them. I can take the floor, Jack Carter said, though the words felt half out of habit. Her gaze didn't waver. You gave me the bed so I wouldn't freeze. I'm not freezing now. Something shifted in the air, an understanding neither had voiced until then. Jack didn't move closer immediately, but he didn't step back either. The stove popped, sending a thin crackle of sparks up the pipe. "You want it back?" she asked, quieter this time. "Not if you leave it," he said. That settled it, without either needing to state terms. She laid down first, staying on the far side of the narrow mattress blanket pulled across her middle. He doused the lamp, leaving only the stove's glow across the walls, then sat at the edge of the bed. The boards creaked under his weight. She didn't flinch or turn away. When he lowered himself beside her, barely any space remained between them. The heat from her skin reached him through the blanket. Smoke rising from the fire mingled with something warmer that hadn't been there when she arrived, half frozen. He lay on his back at first, staring at the low roof beams, hands resting over his ribs. She shifted once the fabric of the mended dress brushing his arm. The touch was light, but heavier than any word spoken between them. "You don't have to stay," he said, after a long silence, though it sounded more like a test of himself than her. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I am." He turned his head, catching her eyes in the dim light. Her gaze was open, watching him not in fear or dullness, but with the same sharp calm she'd carried when she knocked on his door. The difference now, she didn't look ready to run. The first touch happened without planning. She shifted again under the blanket, and his hand brushed her hip through the fabric. He didn't pull away fast enough, and she didn't move. For a breath, neither spoke. Her voice came low, close, not a whisper. "You still don't know what I offered that night." He looked at her, then remembering her on the porch, skin blue with cold. "I didn't want you to give it to live," he said. "That don't mean I don't." He stopped there, words caught between truth and restraint. She reached out, not desperate, not timid. Her fingers touched the side of his jaw, light as a breath, but intentional. "I'm not offering to survive," she said. "I'm offering because I'm warm now." Yet her thumb grazed the edge of his beard, loosening something in him that had been locked since the graves on the ridge. He didn't crush her or rush. He moved slow, careful, like a man handling something that might vanish if he was careless. He slid his arm beneath her shoulders, drawing her toward him, an inch at a time. Her breath hitched when his chest met hers, but she didn't pull away. The blanket slipped to her waist, and the repaired collar of the dress shifted again, revealing more of the curve of her chest than before. His eyes dropped briefly, then his hand covered where fabric and skin met. The first kiss wasn't rushed or clumsy. He leaned in only after she didn't turn her face. When his lips pressed hers, she breathed out, releasing the hold she'd kept since the night she arrived. He tasted smoke and cold and something stubbornly alive. She put one hand on his chest, not to stop him, but to feel the weight of him there. When they broke apart, neither spoke. The space between their breaths was enough. Outside, snow fell heavier. Inside the bed that had been empty for 3 winters now held 2 bodies that didn't turn from each other. Jack didn't think about tomorrow, the thaw, or men who might still hunt her. He only knew she wasn't begging this time, and he wasn't offering mercy. For the first night since death had taken what was his sleep, didn't feel like surrender. It felt like staying. The snow stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the world blank and heavy with silence. Jack woke first, though, for the first time in years. His body hadn't jerked awake from some memory he couldn't outrun. Emmy Lou lay against him, her head near his shoulder. One arm draped across his chest. The mended dress still half on her, the neckline slipped low and tangled in the blanket. Her breathing was steady, unhurried, not like the shallow gasps of the first night on his floor. Jack didn't move right away. The cabin was dim, pale light slipping through the frosted window. The stove still held coals, but the air carried a sharp bite. Emmy Lou Whitlow stirred slowly, naturally, not out of fear. Her eyes opened, meeting his without flinching or retreating. "You slept," Jack Carter said quietly. "So did you," she answered. She didn't rush to cover herself or move to the other side of the bed. Instead, she stayed. Her fingers traced the seam of the shirt as she sat up. The blanket fell to her waist, and the curve of her back showed where the dress had slipped down an arm. She reached to pull it up, but not with haste. Anyone watching might have wondered if what passed between them in the dark would send her away or turn him to stone by morning. The answer came in their next movements. Jack stood, pulled on his trousers, and lit the stove with the remaining kindling. He didn't tell her to move or act as if the night had been a mistake meant to be buried. She rose from the bed and crossed the room barefoot, slipping his shirt off the peg and over her head again while the dress dried by the fire. As she tied it closed beneath her chest, she asked a question that had shadowed the story from the start. "If someone comes asking about me, will you tell them?" He didn't look away. "This is my land, my cabin, and who's inside it is my business." She absorbed that with a slow nod. Another question lingered if she stayed. What did that make her in his eyes? She didn't ask, but he answered without words. "You don't live here because you're owed shelter," he said. "You live here because you're staying." She took it in quietly, not uncertainly. "I don't want to leave." "Then you won't." He stepped outside to check the animals while she set water to heat. Snow lay thick across the yard, smoothing the land. He shoveled a path to the trough, breath fogging in the cold air, glancing toward the ridge where the graves lay beneath the cottonwoods. For the first time since digging them, the site didn't feel like an open wound. Inside, the smell of simmering beans met him. Emmy Lou stood at the table, sleeves rolled, hair braided loosely over one shoulder. The rifle rested against the wall within her reach, but not clutched like before. She glanced at him once, then asked what anyone in town surely would sooner or later. "If they come, they'll see me. They'll have questions. Can they ask?" "They don't take what's mine off this land," he said, setting his gloves on the table. She didn't correct him. Instead, she tested the truth of it. "Am I yours now?" she asked. He didn't rush, didn't soften the answer. "If you stay, you're not passing through. You're not someone I hide behind walls. You're part of this place. Same as me." Her breath eased. She nodded once. Acceptance, not hesitation. One piece remained unspoken. What tethered them beyond the cold and the night they'd shared, Jack gave the answer in action, not words. After they ate, he pulled on his coat and looked toward the ridge. "I'm going up to clear the snow off the markers. I don't leave them under drift." She didn't ask permission to follow. She pulled on the flannel trousers under the dress again, wrapped his spare scarf around her neck, and stepped into his old boots, stuffing cloth at the toes to close the gaps. He didn't argue. They walked the path he'd worn over 3 winters, snow up to their calves. The air bit at their cheeks, but the climb was steady, the sky pale and empty. At the ridge, 2 mounds sat beneath the cottonwoods. Their crosses were half buried. Jack brushed the snow off each marker with his glove. Emmy Lou stood beside him, silent, respectful. He rested a hand on the small wooden cross for the child. For the first time since digging it, his shoulders loosened instead of locking. When he stepped back, she asked nothing about the past, only one thing of the future. "You want me here when spring comes?" Yes, he said without pause. If she still wanted it, then she swept snow from the markers, as well as if tending them was now part of her place. When she straightened, he looked at her not as a burden or debt, but as someone who had already rooted herself in the cabin he once kept hollow. They walked back down the ridge without hurry. The sky remained open, the air cold, but no longer carried the bite of loneliness. When they reached the porch, she paused before stepping inside. "Then I stay," she said. "Not for warmth, for good." Jack opened the door, letting her pass first. The wind had not stopped, and snow would come again before spring. But inside the cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. The silence belonged to two people who had already chosen what came next, with no questions left hanging over the door.